New York, 1931. A giant has passed and an era has ended. The lights go out in the city for the first time in many people's lives. They understood, briefly, what it was like to live on planet Earth before the time of Thomas Edison. Welcome to this episode of Visionaries, Rebels and Machines. My name is Jamie Dobson. We are going to be picking up today exactly where we left off last time. And where did we leave off? What was happening in the life and the adventures of Thomas Alva Edison? We know that he started off as an entrepreneur on the Port Huron to Detroit line, but before we knew it, whoosh, he was an itinerant telegrapher, and then before we knew it again, boom, he was not only a successful, but he was a famous inventor working out of his Newark workshop in New York City. So then, where was Thomas at the end of the last episode? Well, we left him at his Menlo Park facility in possession of what seemed like a sensible light bulb. And it was sensible enough, indeed, for him to call New York's press and all of his financiers out to Menlo Park, where he, quite frankly, blew them away with that remarkable New Year's Eve demonstration. He was back. He'd shown them he was back. The Wizard of Menlo Park was back. Yes, not quite. There was a small problem. Edison's optimism and confidence maybe, just maybe, had gotten the better of him. What exactly had Francis Upton and Thomas Edison got working just before that demonstration? A high-resistance light bulb with a filament that lasted for about 10 or 15 hours. Great. This was, Edison thought, the first step in just a few steps to a really commercially viable light bulb that would not last 10 or 15 hours, but maybe 500, 600, or even 1,000 hours. In other words, Thomas Edison assumed with continuous improvements to the filament choice itself, because that was not yet settled, and of course improvements to the vacuum seal, which the filament would be encased within, he would be able to make not just a light bulb, but because the bulb was high resistance, he'd be able to create a whole system to subdivide light that was commercially viable. This is why that New Year's Eve demonstration was so important. However, very soon afterwards, a complication arose. Well, where do we now pick this story up then, and what is this complication? Well, we pick up the story on the 27th and the 28th of January, just a few weeks after the demonstration. Edison received on the 27th patent number 223898. That was the patent for the electric lamp or the incandescent light bulb. It had been granted. The very next day, with the new patent in hand, Edison signed and executed patent application number 369280 for his system to distribute electricity. Therefore, this was the vital moment for Thomas Edison and his backers. Make or break. Go or don't go. Why? The reason is simple. In order to bring that second patent to life, the system to distribute electricity, mountains of capital was required. Thomas Edison and his team needed to invent many components from scratch. Other components needed perfecting. Were they ready to commit to this? Did they think they would succeed? Would the Wizard of Menlo Park work his magic just one more time? For Thomas Edison, it was a no-brainer, and we now know, because history tells us, it was a no-brainer for the financial backers too. The prize was just too big. The decision was made. We are going. And because that decision was made, it was time to scale, and it was time for Thomas to continue to build that team at Menlo Park. Francis Upton was, of course, already there. Edison had given him the nickname Culture because of his maths degree. It is worth noting, my dear listener, that you didn't need to be that well educated at Menlo Park to invite tremendous hazing from Edison and his fellow Americans. Basic Lawson, that's John Lawson, he picked up the name because he was extremely argumentative, especially about base oxides. And my personal favourite nickname goes to Martin Force. He was called Farting Morse. The cerebral Charles Clark, he had a master's degree, how dare he, came into the team as an electrical engineer, but it turns out his draftsmanship was so good that that's what he ended up doing for Thomas Edison out at Menlo Park. This collection of people starts to offer us an explanation as to why Thomas Edison was able to out-invent other inventors. He had a team, so he could experiment in parallel. This was true when he was building that system to subdivide and distribute light, and it was true thereafter when he got into mining, and after that, when he, believe it or not, invented the world's first cinema camera. This puts to bed, doesn't it, this peculiar idea that Thomas Edison was a lone inventor. As we've just heard, this could not be further from the truth. And indeed, going all the way back to the workshop in Newark, and actually while we're at it, going all the way back to the Port Huron line, Edison showed he was a great team player. In fact, not only was he a good team player, he was good at building teams, good at working with other people. That's to say, he was a good manager. By the time he started to scale things up at Menlo Park, he was able to coordinate work so that things ran in parallel. So this idea of Edison as a lone engineer or a lone scientist, it's a very romantic idea. We can blame the second scientific revolution and the romantics for that. Humans love to think that there is a lone scientist, a mad Victor Frankenstein, and boom, ideas come in eureka moments. All the evidence paints a very, very different picture. As well as being a good manager, there is of course one other thing that we think about when we think of Thomas Edison, and that was his dedication to trial and error. This became known as the Edison method, and of course it caused some people to make fun of Thomas Edison. They said he wasn't that clever, he simply searched around in the dark until he, by chance, found something, found the phonograph, found the incandescent light bulb. This fun or this ridicule was extremely misplaced. Trial and error is the only way to proceed when there is no prior art. And so the Edison method, the trial and error method, is vitally important to us computer programmers and leaders who either work in cloud computing or right now the emerging world of generative AI. We are building things that have never been built before. So if you view innovation and invention as a trial and error journey through a search space, then Thomas Edison from his grave teaches us today a lot about how to move forward. So where there's no prior art, and this is the key lesson here, trial and error is really the only way forward. That is what we learned from Edison. This is not necessarily science, but it is somewhat scientific. So now let's get back to the story. Thomas Edison and the team progressed using their trial and error method to improve components and to make sure the components they built played well together. Upton, along with Edison, were still seeking out the perfect filament to go inside the light bulb. Upton was nervous. Thomas Edison was, of course, much more optimistic. Unlike Upton, though, Edison had more than one thing on his mind. After the patent was granted back in January, the very first thing on Thomas Edison's mind was the prime movers. These were the steam engines and the dynamos and all of those things Michael Faraday came up with, but exploded or expanded to an absolutely gigantic scale. They had to be big enough to power a whole district in New York. The power coming from the prime movers then needed to be regulated. Thomas Edison started to think about the mains. He'd borrowed that term from the subdivision of gas across New York. The mains in the electricity system would of course be the copper cables. They would carry power from the station all the way to people's houses and factories. But that power needed to be regulated. That was a problem Edison and his team had not yet solved. Then of course there was the question of location. Where would the pipes or where would the mains go? Edison did not want them to go above ground and compete with the tangled web of wires that had arrived because of the telegraph and William Orton's Western Union, and of course the subsequent arrival of Alexander Graham Bell's telephone wires. There was a sprawling mess above New York, a complete spider's web of chaos. Edison did not want to contribute to that. His idea was to bury the mains in the sidewalk. All of that would require labour and therefore would require money, and of course it would require bribes for city officials. Now, if the cables were going underground, they needed to be waterproof. They needed, in other words, to be insulated so that the circuit wouldn't short in exactly the same way it had shorted out in Samuel Morse's system on the Baltimore to Washington line. But of course, those pipes just didn't need to be waterproof. They needed to be rodent-proof as well, because these gigantic New York rats would eat absolutely anything and everything. And now to the electric meter. It's at this moment I want us to pause for a second and remember Edison's system to subdivide light was about the delivering of light and electricity as a service. This had never been done before. Posh people installed generators and grabbed some wires, grabbed some old and ancient incandescent light bulbs and installed them in their houses. This was a capital expenditure. But Thomas Edison's idea was to take the hit on all the capital that was needed. More likely, his financial backers would take the hit on the capital expenditure that was needed, and then electricity was delivered and measured as a service. In other words, customers paid for only what they used. This is, of course, why AWS and cloud computing is sometimes compared to the electricity grid. The idea with the cloud is that you pay for only the compute that you use, and it is, of course, delivered as a service. So AWS take the hit on the capital in exactly the same way that Edison took the hit on the huge amount of capital needed to build his system. When Thomas Edison dreamed up his idea of electricity as a service, he had the following in mind. There would be a power meter that had not yet been invented. On one side of the power meter was Edison's power plant, his machinery, and the mains, and all of the things he'd changed the capital into. On the other side of the meter was the person's house or factory and their applications. Everything on that side of the power meter was the responsibility of the customer, and everything on the other side of the power meter was the responsibility of Thomas Edison. This was another open question then at Menlo Park. How would the meter work? How would you detect the flow of electricity passing from the mains into a house? Now, it is true, you can compare the flow of electrons to the flow of water, but you can't measure electrons in the same way as you can measure water. It's completely different. And so this is just another example of one of the things that Edison needed to invent and perfect. And don't forget, it had to be tamper-proof so people couldn't cheat the system. All of these challenges, from the prime movers all the way to the electricity meter, were absolutely massive. But, and this is where you see Edison as the master coordinator, the organisation of his teams allowed them to move at pace and in parallel. All of the work progressed nicely, including a crucial piece of work. Ludwig Boehm headed an extremely talented group of glass blowers. The challenge for the incandescent light bulb was always about getting a filament that wouldn't get too hot and wouldn't burn out too quickly. But there was a second part of the bulb equation. It needed to be in a vacuum. So the better the vacuum seal and the better the light bulb, the greater the probability the filament would last longer and longer and longer. Ludwig Boehm made fantastic progress with his work on the light bulb. And it was important for one extra reason. It needed to be standardized. So once they'd got a fantastic vacuum seal, the bulb then needed to be prepared for mass manufacturing. That was penciled to start in the fall, only 8 or 9 months after the patent had been granted. This is the second part of Thomas Edison's business model. He would provide lighting as a service and thus make money in one way, and he would provide replacement light bulbs when they eventually burnt out or the vacuum seal failed, which of course one day they eventually would. At this point in the story, as spring gave way to summer, everything was going swimmingly. Under Edison's guidance, multiple teams made progress on multiple fronts. But the passing of time proved Francis Upton right. They could not make progress on the filament. Upton began to wonder, was it even possible to create a light bulb that was high resistance? Charles Batchelor at the same time grew frantic with frustration. The factory was scheduled to produce light bulbs in the fall, but by the beginning of summer, they had not even finished it. They had not even found the filament that would go into the bulb. Were these fears and frustrations and doubts rational or irrational? Charles Batchelor's perspective was simple. The clock was ticking. Manufacturing was due to begin, and he had nothing to manufacture. But nevertheless, things could be put on hold as Thomas and Francis Upton caught him up. But Francis Upton had different doubts, different fears. He was left wondering, was it even possible to create a high-resistance light bulb? The doubts in Upton's mind, originally placed there by his University of Heidelberg education, had amplified in the months after that New Year's Eve demonstration. When Thomas Edison's ideas made it across the Atlantic, they were met with ridicule and scorn, and the whole of England and Germany's academic institutions are rising up in unison. This idea did not work. It could not work. It was a con job. As the months progressed, Upton started to think that maybe all of those doubters were right. Well, what on earth were those doubters saying? What was all of this noise, and how and why did it cause so much trouble for Thomas Edison as he persevered in his attempts to find a filament to go into his light bulb, to go into his system to subdivide light? It all started after that New Year's Eve demonstration. Nature magazine said that Edison's idea was a hopeless failure. Wrong in design, wrong in principle, useful in showing how singularly devoid of sound scientific knowledge a clever, practical man can... Oh my goodness, that's English pomposity right there on display. A clever, practical man, that's Thomas Edison by the way, can make progress despite being devoid of any sound scientific knowledge. Edison could deal with this nonsense from Europe. He'd visited the UK and met Wheatstone to talk about the telegraph. In the United States, though, this criticism stung a little bit. Henry Morton at the Stevens Institute described the light bulb as a conspicuous failure. What, Morton hypothesized, could Thomas Edison possibly achieve that men like Maxim and Weston and Siemens had already attempted and, of course, failed to succeed with? If they had tried and they could not do it, what possibly could this huckster Thomas Edison do that they hadn't done? And besides, Morton said, it did not matter. If Edison could solve the incandescent light problem, that's to say, it doesn't matter if you can get the thing to burn longer than 20, 30 or 40 hours, because the power demand for a low resistant light bulb would simply be too much. There wouldn't be enough copper in the world to create the mains to feed such a system. You now see that Henry Morton is just wrong. He doesn't understand the key insight into Edison's system. The English and the Germans, they did understand it, but they didn't believe it. This is probably the most important lesson in the history of technology. You see, the trouble all started with arc lamps. You remember those things, right? I whistled about them in the last episode. I'm not going to do that again. What were arc lamps? Well, they were high current and low resistance devices. They worked by essentially simulating lightning, which jumped between two electrodes, jumped between a gap between two electrodes. The greater the current for arc lamps, the stronger the light. So now continue this chain of thought, this logical chain of thought. A similar idea arises in the mind of the ancient scientists and lighting engineers. The incandescent light bulb must follow the same logic. The greater the current and the lower the resistance, the hotter the lamp will burn. The hotter it will burn, the brighter it will shine. Now let's just take a sideward step for a second and see if we can understand electrical circuits. And I think the best way to do that is to listen or to read Jack Kilby's Nobel Prize acceptance speech. He starts by saying, C.R. Reid has pointed out that building a circuit is like building a sentence. You should take a look at T.R. Reid's The Chip. It's absolutely fantastic. I continue now as Kilby. There are certain standard components, nouns, verbs, and adjectives in a sentence, and resistors, capacitors, and diodes in a circuit. Okay, boom, there we go. A circuit is a bit like a sentence. It's got capacitors and diodes and resistors instead of verbs and nouns and stuff like that. But what do these components do, and what is their relationship to current passing through the circuit? Okay, now we're going to shift gears one more time. Electrons, it was said, are comparable to water flowing through a system of pipes. That's to say, electrons flowing through a circuit are somewhat similar to how water flows around a system of pipes. The metaphor doesn't last indefinitely, but it definitely holds for the work we're doing with Edison. Imagine then a simple circuit. This one is a hose pipe. If you tie a knot in the hose pipe, the flow of water will slow down, and that's because the resistance of the circuit has gone up. So we can think about resistors as something that slows down the flow of the electrical current or the electrons in the current. A capacitor, on the other hand, stores electricity exactly the same way that a tank stores water. Now, if you can store water up and release it when you want to release it, then you can regulate the flow. So a capacitor is about regulation. And then, of course, you get the easiest of all of them, the diode. The diode is a tap. So water can pass through a tap, but it cannot pass back into it. Electrons pass through a diode, but they cannot pass back. These basic components of an electrical circuit, you'll be amazed how far you can take them in building intelligent machines. So with all of these things in mind, only now, do we understand how and why Edison managed to turn the whole world upside down. If the filament, that's to say the wire, was wound tight, exactly like a hose pound going round and round and round and round, then the resistance of the circuit would go up. This served two genius purposes. The first was that more light would be cast as the surface area of the filament was greater. That makes sense, doesn't it? The more metal, pulsating heat and light, the more light you would get. However, and this is the real kicker, like a wound hose pipe, less water or less current in the example of the incandescent light bulb was needed. This concept has two serious implications. The first is that copper wires bringing the water or electricity would be much smaller, thus making a system to subdivide light possible. That is to say, the copper mains would be thin enough to bring electricity to houses and to factories. The second implication is that the filament would be much cooler. Less current or less water, to keep to the metaphor, less current flowing into that lamp would generate less friction and less heat. It would therefore take much longer to burn out. So when these observations meet the remarkable progress Edison's team were having with vacuum seals and light bulbs, then a system to subdivide light in Thomas Edison's hands doesn't become possible, but actually starts to become probable. All of this is documented fantastically in Edmund Morris's biography of Edison. Everything happens on page 572. It goes something like this. Edison noticed that the finer the wire and the tighter it was wound, the greater its luminosity. Now, everybody, we know that's just a posh way of saying that the bulb was brighter. But, of course, as Morris continues, this is another way of saying the higher the resistance of the filament, the more efficient the lamp. This phenomenon, or this observation, led Edison to formulating his electric light law. The amount of heat lost by a body is proportionate to the radiating surface of that body. Boom! This was the key insight that stimulated another just as radical. If Thomas's lamps as resistors increased the dissipation of energy as heat and light, they would consummatively decrease the size of conductors needed to feed the current. Edison thus reversed the consensus among illumination engineers that an extended network of subdivided lamps would offer as little resistance as possible to the circulation of current. This is Morris, and I quote, "They were ludicrously wrong," unquote. Boom! Now, there we've got it. Edison's huge insight turned the world on its head, and it showed a different way of thinking, and a different approach to this problem was better. But it also showed that every single engineer and scientist who studied electricity and lighting in Germany, and by the way, I mean every single one in Germany and England and the United States, were simply wrong. Edison was alone in having this insight. Francis Upton, God bless his cotton socks, believe it or not, also didn't think that this was possible. He was a graduate of the University of Heidelberg, and the orthodoxy said light bulbs, incandescent light bulbs, cannot be high resistance. Many, many years later, in 1918, he said the following: "The one great impression of my years in Menlo Park was how impenetrable the veil of the future seems to be when new problems are to be solved, and how simple the result often is when the darkness of ignorance is lighted by the genius of one man." Well, the one man was Thomas Edison. His stubbornness, his focus, and his intelligence had seen something that the whole world could not see and would not see. And thus we come to the end of what I think is the most important lesson in technology. You have to see things differently. Edison saw them differently. Upton did not. And you have to be ready to swim against the tide. However, by learning about Edison's electric light law, we get a basic insight into how circuits work and how electricity works. And of course, that's very important for us as we continue our journey into the world of visionaries, rebels, and machines, because those circuits would eventually become information machines or computers. Right then, let's now get back to the main story. So we have discussed capacitors and resistors and their relationship to the flow of electricity, which is a little bit like the flow of water. And that seems obvious, and it may seem obvious to you. But until that very moment when Thomas Edison looked at the problem afresh, the consensus was not reversed. Nobody, none of those learned gentlemen believed this could be true. This made Thomas Edison's backers pause for thought. They became anxious and tense because they were worried they would never get their money back. How could it be that everybody in the world was wrong and somehow Thomas Edison was right? Just as Edison must have thought, well, things can't get much worse for me right now, they got worse. Joseph Swan, an engineer in England, took a look at Edison's system to subdivide light and said, well, I've already done this. So, therefore, there wasn't a one-headed but two-headed monster now stalking Thomas Edison. The first was all the noise and the criticism around the high-resistant light bulb. The second was Joseph Swan's claims that this system was not unique. What this meant was, even if Edison's backers decided to continue to fund him, they would never get their money back because they would never get granted a patent to exploit their future monopoly position. Describing this time in Thomas Edison's adventures, Edmund Morris says the following: "To his people, Edison was an Ubermensch, but to his financial backers, he was an uncontrollable fantasist, half genius, half fool." So they were listening to the criticisms coming out of Germany and England. To his rivals, Thomas Edison was a publicity whore with no special originality. And sadly, to Mary, he'd become a stranger. Alone in the house, raising two children, Mary's physical and mental health deteriorated. Edison was oblivious to this. The promise he'd made to Mary's father had been broken. Edison, throughout this period, employed that laser-like focus of his. It allowed him to ignore the state of his marriage and ignore the state of Mary's mental health. It allowed him to ignore all of the noise coming from Germany and England. Him and Upton rolled their sleeves up and they continued. What else could they do but continue? They needed to find that filament, and the reason was really simple. The light bulb they'd gotten working for 15 hours back on the New Year's Eve demonstration was just a proof of concept. If Edison kept the generators running that evening, and if the guests hung around for 12 or 15 hours, they'd have seen every single light bulb fail, pop, pop, pop. The filament would have burnt out, vacuum seals would have broken. The light bulb needed to be much more resilient than the proof of concept they'd used that evening. But they couldn't find the filament. They couldn't find the solution. Paper soaked in olive oil, maple string soaked in maple syrup. I always thought that one sounded tasty. Rosewood, holly, cotton, coconut, thousands upon thousands of specimens. Edison and Upton tried them all, and eventually Edison screamed in anguish, "In God Almighty's workshop, there must grow a vegetable with geometrically powerful fibers suitable for our use." Well, if this fiber existed in God Almighty's workshop, Thomas Edison and his team could not find it. The despondent Upton was joined, of course, by Batchelor, who was at this point pulling his hair out with frustration. So as the team prepared to light up Lower Manhattan, as the manufacturing group prepared to produce light bulbs at scale, Edison could not get the damn thing to work, and so the search continued. Hickory, rosewood, ginger root, pomegranate peel. So to add to the tasty maple syrup, we're now left thinking, my God in heaven, we could have made a fantastic cup of tea at Menlo Park. Rosewood splints, fragments of eucalyptus, cinnamon bark. You could make cinnamon, you could make a nice cake with cinnamon bark. Well, this was a hellish situation for Upton and Edison. The challenges of building the system to subdivide light had looked insurmountable, but they were systematically being surmounted. Power meters, those rodent-proof cables I told you about, the massive generators, they were being perfected and they were being put together, and all of that was happening in parallel. But all of that would come to nothing if they could not get the light bulb to work. The light bulb as a resistor was the cornerstone idea, the whole of the idea. So as the power stations were built and the meters were invented, Edison found himself in an awful situation where everything was either in place or in motion, was about to be completed, including the factory that would produce the light bulbs. And all Edison had to do was drop this tiny component into the system to make the whole thing work. And the only way he could drop his light bulb into the system was if he could discover the fiber that would make it work for longer than 20 hours. And he could not do it. This must have been, for Edison and the team, the most difficult time they had ever faced. Summer arrived, and that meant fall was on the horizon when manufacturing was supposed to begin. Thomas Edison's optimism, not to mention his systematic process of trial and error, both looked like they had reached their limits. But then the trial and error process produced just one more thing, just the next thing. Bamboo. Bamboo, of all things, it grows straight and it's highly resistant to electrical current. Edison and Upton prepared their first test. The bamboo was carbonized, of course, the bulb was sealed, and they went not to bed. People didn't always sleep in beds at Menlo Park. They slept on desks or underneath desks. But when they came back, they saw the first sample glowed with the brightness of 44 candles. 44. What on earth was going on? Japanese bamboo. Let's try Japanese bamboo, they said. This was the next idea. This was the next variation. The Japanese bamboo lasted 3.5 hours before burning out. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, that's nowhere near as long as the original 15 hours. That's true. But the Japanese sample glowed with the brightness of 77 candles. It didn't last long, but it did burn brighter. Now, of course, Edison and Upton came to the same conclusion that maybe you're coming to right now. Well, if it glows for 3.5 hours at 77 candles, let's turn the voltage down. That mattered. It mattered because 77 candles was way too bright for commercial use or within a household. In fact, it was about 4 times too bright. Once the voltage went down, the light would become appropriate, but so too would the probability that the damn thing would last a little bit longer. They began their preparations, they switched on the new bulb, and they let it run and run and run and run. Then it happened. The original lamp, back when collective amnesia kicked in, lasted about 12 hours. The bamboo lamp, at the correct current, only 110 volts were passing through it. You remember volts, right, Mr. Volta? Lasted 1,200 hours. 1,200 hours. My God in heaven, they must have thought. That's what I'm thinking right now. They have done it, and right in the nick of time. And don't forget, listener, this isn't a work of fiction. This isn't a play or a movie. It is a true story. Weeks before manufacturing was meant to ramp up, systems were being built, the sidewalk was being dug up, and at the very last minute, they found the filament that could go into the bulb, and the bulb could go into the system. It was now Edison and Hammers and Uptons and Bachelors' turn to form a Congo line and dance around their benches and throughout their workshop that evening in exactly the same way that Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Watson had done when they figured out the harmonic telegraph. What did they sing as they kicked their legs and waved their arms? History does not record it, but I like to think that they were singing, "We've got an incandescent light bulb, we've got an incandescent light bulb, we've got an incandescent light bulb," because they indeed had an incandescent light bulb. And guess what? It was a high resistance bulb. This was the biggest fuck you that Thomas Edison could have ever given to those snobs in England and Germany. And in delivering that big fuck you back to Europe, Thomas Edison does us a massive favour. He busts the myth that invention begins on a scientist's workbench. It did in the case of Volta, but it did not in the case of Edison's electric light law. So for all of those snobs who accused him of being a man devoid of scientific knowledge, he had proven them wrong. A practical man in pursuit of a vision had done something that all of the world's scientists and lighting engineers could not do. In other words, Thomas Edison, in creating his system to subdivide light, really did upend humanity's understanding of electricity. And the work out at Menlo Park toppled a first domino that would lead to the illumination of the whole of society in the following century. The work at Menlo Park, though, wasn't the only thing that came to a natural and useful conclusion. The threat from Joseph Swan dissipated. They didn't fight each other, but instead decided to collaborate. Swan, when he looked again at Edison's work, graciously admitted that Thomas had come up with something different. It is true, Swan had invented an incandescent light bulb, and it is true he'd wired up stately homes. But Swan's light bulb was low resistance. He graciously then accepted that Thomas had made more progress than he had ever done, and rather than fighting him, they ended up going into business together. This led to the Edison and Swan Company, which was called Ediswan, and together they made great progress, especially around the manufacturing of vacuum bulbs, which many years later would have serious implications for the computer industry because Joseph Swan created the very first vacuum tubes. So not long after that evening, when Hammer burst into the room holding, as Edmund Morris says, the light bulb as if it was the Holy Grail and the Congo was danced, things really did pick up pace. Edison got the Pearl Street power station working, and then after that came Chicago, London, Philadelphia. The Edison Electric Company was founded, and this was another innovation, but not a technical innovation. It was a business or illegal innovation. It was the world's first holding company, and it was through this holding company that Edison and his backers organised their business interests. This time around, dear listener, this time around, he really had done it. The old man was 35. Not long after the work completed, the grid itself moved on, but so too did Edison. He moved away from electricity and the grid and ended up contributing not back to the invention of devices for recording sound, but devices for recording motion pictures. The grid itself, however, continued without Edison. He started a ball rolling. It would not stop anytime soon. Not long after the Pearl Street station opened, from the creative mind of Nikola Tesla came the AC generator. The AC system was special. It allowed electricity to be transported at a high voltage and then stepped down with a transformer so it could be consumed safely at a low voltage. This was a remarkable innovation because it allowed the power station to be placed miles and miles away from the consumer of the electricity. The Pearl Street station was close to the houses in Lower Manhattan that it served. This was a severe limitation of the DC system. However, AC also meant something in business terms. Nikola Tesla and his business partner Westinghouse spotted something that Sears and Roebuck would spot a few years later with their mail order catalogue. And they had spotted something that was uniquely American. Well, pray tell, what had they spotted? What was this uniquely American thing? America is geographically massive, and the citizens who live there are dispersed over the whole continent. Millions of them live in cities, but millions of them do not. They live in mid-sized or small towns, or even in farmsteads and villages spread right across the continent. Sears and Roebuck made the astute observation: if all of those people could be magically collected into a single virtual marketplace, that marketplace would be massive. Imagine, for example, having a department store in a city with tens of millions of people living inside it. Well, Sears and Roebuck realized they didn't need to bring citizens to their shop, but instead they could take their shop to the citizens. And they did that by taking advantage of a brand new technology, the American Postal Service. So their mail order catalogue, plus a few other innovations, for example, there were lines of credit and customers could return goods without any questions being asked. So Sears and Roebuck used this fantastic technology and different incentives to create loyal customers. This is exactly what AC allowed Tesla and Westinghouse to do. Were these two the last to try this? Absolutely not. In the following century, Sam Walton arrived. He had a supermarket, it's called Walmart, and he realized with a very clever algorithm, for want of a better word, he could serve mid-sized towns. So using logistics and new technologies of supply chain management of the day, it was around about the 1980s when this really started to kick off, Sam Walton with Walmart tapped in to the same virtual marketplace. Sam Walton was the hero of a young man called Jeff Bezos. When we think of Amazon, we think of generative AI, cloud computing, and flying to space in a penis-shaped rocket. But Amazon had much humbler origins. Like Sam Walton, Bezos wanted to address a geographically displaced market, and he wanted to provide outstanding customer value and customer service. Like Sears and Roebuck, Bezos decided to use the technology of the day to do that. His web catalogue was really not much different to Sears and Roebuck's mail order catalogue. And so all of a sudden, this virtual bookstore, which could serve the whole of America, was tapping into new technologies, true, but into a very old idea. And that old idea is simple. Use the technologies of the day to change a huge geographically dispersed market into one single virtual marketplace. That is the legacy of the AC system, and the AC system is the legacy of what happened when Edison moved out the way and let the next generation run with the idea of the power grid. As to Edison himself, after he moved away from the grid and the grid moved away from him, he lived a long and fruitful life. He didn't make good on the promise to Mary's father, however. She died only a couple of years after the successes of 1880. She had at that point 3 children. Some historians say she died of an accidental overdose, but given her mental state, it's not difficult to speculate that maybe the overdose wasn't accidental. But either way, despite the fact that she was surrounded by people at Menlo Park, she died alone and in considerable mental and physical pain. This story is as old as time. A man, like a deranged Victor Frankenstein, pursues their ambitions relentlessly, whilst all the unpaid labour of raising children and keeping the house together falls to a woman. The women in the lives of all of these famous inventors often get written out of history or are simply a footnote in it. So when all the excitement was happening, the conga lines were being danced, light bulbs lasted 12 hours, and they were held aloft as if they were the Holy Grail. Whilst all this was happening and all the people were celebrating, Mary Edison was alone in her house with the children. This paints a very different picture of what was happening at Menlo Park in 1880. And I think it's a picture we should hold on to for just a moment. Edison outlived Mary by another 50 years. When he passed away at the ripe old age of 82, a national treasure by that point, President Hoover asked over the radio for people to turn their lights off as a mark of respect to the great man. For the first time in decades, New Yorkers understood what life was like before Thomas Edison arrived and changed the course of humanity forever. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Visionaries, Rebels and Machines on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people to discover the show, and of course, we'd like a few more listeners. To find out more about me, the work I do, or to buy a copy of the book, please visit the website. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next episode.